Testing. All right. So now I'm going to cover volume 12. So the first important conclusion that I make in volume 12 is that hierarchy is uncontestable. The fact that hierarchies exist, the fact that hierarchy is real is something you can't contradict, because even in the attempt of claiming that hierarchies do not exist, you imply that one argument is superior to another. So hierarchy is definitely real. In fact, any act of selection is a value judgment, whether it is subconscious or unconscious. Sorry, whether it's subconscious or conscious. So even if you're consciously making a value judgment, that is no different from if you're subconsciously prioritizing one thing or another. So even like a subconscious bias would be, in my opinion, equivalent to value judgment. And I'm arguing against methodological individualism, which this is just a technical point, but basically an economic framing of action would be that individuals act, but actually the entire universe is engaging in action, because there's no separation within reality. Yes, an individual acts, but an individual is a part of the universe. And so the purpose of life is to move up the value hierarchy. And when I say upward movement, that's metaphorical. All language is metaphorical. The purpose of life is to maximize ascension up the value hierarchy. So because hierarchy is real, value is real, therefore you want to maximize value. That is the purpose of life. You want to move up the value hierarchy. And when you're at the top of the value hierarchy, you need to keep moving up. So why is Ascensionism the best religion? Because all worldviews are ultimately religious. Since we have a limited attention, our brains cannot understand all of reality, so every conscious being must choose what to focus on at the expense of other things. So if you care about one thing, that means you have to care about other things less, right? You can't put the entire universe into your brain, right? So you have to basically you have to prioritize your attention. And the way in which you prioritize your attention is by focusing it on something at the top. So whatever you consider more valuable than everything else, that is your God. And you use this God to sort of direct your attention like a compass, right? So whatever you put on top of your value hierarchy functions as your God. To invest more attention in something than anything else is to worship it. By definition, Ascensionism is the supreme religion. It places ascent itself atop the hierarchy. Any opposing religion must glorify stagnation or descent instead. And this is just by definition. Now, because ascent always wants to surpass all categories and wants to be, so Ascensionism wants to transcend the value hierarchy and create more value. In this way, it's more magnificent than any other religion, and so by definition, it is the supreme religion. Elevatum, which is the principle of endless ascent, is the one true God. If you're not at the top, climb higher. If you are at the top, climb even further by transcending the hierarchy you conquered and discovering or creating a higher one. And this is very important. Ascensionism is inherently against finality or mindless worship of status quo. So in principle, Ascensionism is against finish lines. The idea that there will be a state of existence with sufficient joy such that no more action is necessary is very disturbing. It asserts that at some point upward striving should cease, that at some point you should get into a coffin and become a motionless corpse. It doesn't matter how luxurious the coffin is. And then here's the anti-heaven argument. So the problem with the Pascal's wager, so often Christians will use the Pascal's wager argument to say why you should believe in Christianity. The problem with Pascal's wager is that you're assuming that heaven is some great reward, but really, Christianity is often a slave morality. And then, so you're going to sacrifice your life for slave morality, and then you're going to be a slave in the afterlife by spending an eternity worshiping the same God who made you a slave. So, yes, if you're in heaven, sure, you think you're free, you think you're happy, but not really. You're actually just stuck in a set of clouds. You're just going to stare at clouds all day. You're just going to, listen to angels play the piano. You're going to just worship God for eternity. It's not actually a very happy life. It's just, you're spiritually stagnant. You're basically dead. Like, you're basically a parasite of heaven. So you don't even exist, really. You don't have your independent identity. You're a slave. You're a domesticated animal. And this will only lead to misery. So the idea that heaven is a reward, I think, is completely delusional. It's like telling a cow that, just live in my farm forever. And, yeah, you won't be slaughtered. Yeah, you can eat grass all day, but that's a completely pointless life. Like, you're going to sit on your ass all day on a couch. It's like, how is heaven a reward? It doesn't make any sense. So, the butcher cow metaphor. You will enjoy becoming ground beef because you will achieve eternal tranquility. Heaven worship is a death cult. Slave morality advertising a permanent coffin as a comfortable hammock. Yeah, so this idea that, just standing in the same place forever is somehow the epitome of happiness. So the idea that non-existence is happiness. I mean, that's what worshiping heaven really is. You're just gonna be a nothing burger. You're going to go to heaven. You're gonna become a cloud. You're just gonna rest forever. Like this is just misery. Like this is like castrating yourself and saying now you have more energy. Like it just doesn't make any sense. Like this, anyways. So, I sort of contrast this idea of heaven with Buddhism. At least Buddhists don't say that nirvana is going to promise eternal joy. Like if you meditate and you like absolve the ego or whatever, yeah, you can sure you can be at peace, but this is completely different from believing that having no ego, having no personality of your own is somehow a paradise, right? It's heaven that is the mistake. This idea that you think that you're going to spend your entire life worshiping the slave morality that's Christianity, just so you can spend an eternity worshiping the same slave morality. So you're just gonna be a slave for eternity. You're gonna do nothing but stare at clouds all day, and somehow this is the idea of paradise. Like this is a complete delusion. This is not paradise. This is a comfortable coffin. This is just like really an asylum for crazy people. Like you're stupid enough to believe that heaven is this great place. No, it's really just an asylum, but there's clouds and there's like shiny, I don't know, the glow of the sun or whatever. It seems happy. Look, if you want to, but it's a trap. It's a delusion. But for what it's worth, I'm also against secular utopias as well. So there's the mystical utopia of heaven, and then there's the secular utopia of a socialist paradise. And every form of socialism is really just a form of bureaucratism. They support civilizational mediocrity, expanding the parasitic bureaucrat class, and they will reduce mankind to cattle under a regulatory monopoly. So their justification is utilitarianism. So long as man is well fed and entertained, i.e. sterilized and distracted, and reduced to spreadsheet entries, basically robots, he will live happily ever after. So this is the problem with so let's say you ignore religion, okay? What is the alternative to a spiritual or like a mystical worldview? The alternative is materialism. The problem with materialism is that it becomes moral relativism, and moral relativism just becomes nihilism, and nihilism becomes hedonism, because since nothing matters, all that matters is like pleasure or comfort, right? And so this supports a nanny state, right? It supports bureaucracy, where basically they'll have a monopoly of power over the mediocre masses, and the masses will become like cattle. They will just become well-fed and comfortable, and basically everyone will be a slave and a perfect robot that just follows the arbitrary rules, and you're not allowed to complain because you're comfortable. But the problem is that consciousness is inherently restless. Just having a mind, having thoughts, having the desire to expand. There's a will to power latent in man. So even a so-called utopia will become a breeding ground for resentment. So either man becomes spiritually fallen and they just become zombies, basically. They become lifeless zombies. So they basically stop existing. They just become a parasite of bureaucracy. So they become a parasite of a parasite, and they just descend into this like spiritual stagnation. It's sort of like, imagine a corpse was walking. Imagine you saw a skeleton walking around. Is the skeleton alive? No, it's not alive. It's just moving. Yeah, you're just moving for no purpose. And so either this bureaucratism leads to people becoming lifeless and valueless zombies, or mankind will become angry and they will be engaged in warfare and violence, which will collapse society. So we should not accept a final resting ground. Every finish line is a deathbed, and all states of being, destinations, and outcomes are foundations for greater ascent, not absolute finish lines. So now I talk about knowledge. Yeah, and once again, I'll recommend people actually reading the text, because my explanation of it is not going to be very clear. I'm not rehearsing anything. I'm just talking. Anyways, so on knowledge. So I made the claim that all knowledge is value-laden and intuitive. So we can't know anything for certain. We have no access to anything external to our data set. So our knowledge is entirely circular. We claim to know something because we claim to know something. We think that something is true because we think it's true. There's no external justification that can make us certain of any of our knowledge. And our knowledge is value laden. So everything that we believe in, anything we think is true, we believe it to be true because we have biases, we have value judgments. There's no such thing as a neutral truth, and there's no such thing as an objective truth. It's all based on preference, whether those preferences are subconscious or conscious. So knowledge is provisional or intuitive at best. Rational arguments does not resolve the circularity of epistemology. Any truth claim reaches a conceptual threshold beyond which no further questioning can occur. So take language, for example. How do you understand any word? Well, you understand a word through its definition. But what is the definition of that definition? At some point, you get to a threshold of like existence exists. Like you don't know anything for certain. All you know is that something exists. And how we understand the world is a creation of our intuition and our imagination. Logic cannot provide us with answers. So pure rationalism, I have recognized as useless. So how do we know that A equals A? We just know it's true. How do we know that the law of non-contradiction is true? We don't actually have a justification for it, because it's actually the law of non-contradiction or the law of identity, same thing, right? Those are the preconditions for logic, so it's not derived from logic. We cannot understand a precondition of logic with logic. These are intuitions. And so the law of identity is a logical precondition for conceptual reasoning, but that doesn't necessitate its truthfulness. So yes, maybe the law of identity is false. Maybe contradictions are true. Maybe contradictions do exist, and maybe formal logic is completely false. And just because logic is a precondition for reasoning doesn't mean that logic is true. Just because A equals A is a precondition for us making sense of the world doesn't mean that it's true. Pure rationalism only yields A equals A, and this gives you nothing. So when you think about that, logic itself is completely useless. The only conclusion, so because logic is entirely a system of circular validation, all you can say with logic is A equals A, B equals B, C equals C. You can't actually derive any useful truths from logic itself. So imagine that the only information you were allowed to use to engage in philosophic contemplation was a fact sheet which said A equals A. What could you do with such information? Absolutely nothing. You cannot cure cancer with a sheet of paper that says A equals A. So if all the knowledge you had in the world was just A equals A, you couldn't do anything useful with it. You couldn't produce any innovations or anything. Now, I'm just attacking pure rationalism because rationalism without empirical knowledge is obviously useless. If you don't have any empirical knowledge, if you don't have any experiential data, then rationalism can only net you A equals A, B equals B, like maybe 1 + 1 = 2, right? There's not much you can, and with that information alone is completely useless. But with empirical reasoning, then you can make predictive models. But even predictive models are not like perfectly rational because they're not perfectly justifiable in the sense that an internal system of so empiricism is not a perfectly logical system of validation. It's not an internal self-referential system of validation. It's not like A equals A, which we know is certainly true intuitively, and we can say this is logical. But whereas with empiricism, you can only make predictive models that are not 100% certain, in the same way that you could say A equals A is 100% certain. But ultimately, empiricism and rationalism, they're all derived from our intuition. They're all derived from an unexplainable cognitive faculty called intuition, which is basically a combination of prioritizing attention and value judgment. So how we imagine the universe, what we believe to be true, what we focus on within the universe, that is what intuition is associated with. And intuition is not something that can be fully explained, yet it is intuition that is the foundation for rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism and empiricism themselves are actually completely useless. So A equals A, which is the bedrock of rationality, isn't even discovered by rationality. If the law of identity is the prerequisite for reason, then apprehending A equals A can't itself require reason. The apprehension must be via intuition. Rationality is a tool, not a master or a god. The intuition is the adventure. Rationality is his tool. Worshipping A equals A gets you nowhere. So yes. So intuition is the basis of any real knowledge. Rationalism and empiricism are only tools that are subordinate to intuition. So intuition is based on value judgment and pattern recognition. We can't perfectly understand why we recognize patterns or why we have certain value judgments. Nonetheless, we still accept intuition as valid, because not only is intuition the foundation for logic, but intuition is the master of logic and empiricism. As Hume said, reason is a slave of the emotions or the passions. He said something like that. That's basically true. Except you can't have knowledge through value judgment, because value judgment is prioritization. And your subconscious prioritization is actually how you understand the world, because your brain doesn't focus on everything at once. That would actually be impossible. You can't just focus on every particle in the universe. The brain understands the world through a narrative, and this narrative is based on subconscious prioritization, which is basically value judgment. So we understand the world through preferences, and we understand the world through pattern recognition, which is derived from our neurological structure, which is designed to spot patterns. Maybe it's biological for the purpose of survival, like maybe, right? But the point is that logic and empirical knowledge, those are all tools of the intuition. So the question of what is true is secondary to the question of what is important. For acting agents, the most pressing question is, what should I pursue as a goal, which condenses into what should I invest my limited attention towards. So yes, our attention is limited. So the question is, what should I invest my limited attention in? The question of what is true doesn't really matter. So given that all knowledge is intuitive, there are superior and inferior intuitions. The ascensionary intuitions, knowledge for the purpose of ascent, are the superior form. Those who promote stagnation or decline are clearly mentally ill. They clearly have spiritual diseases. So there's two ways to promote ascensionism. Basically, I say that there's no certain way that ascensionism will succeed. Nonetheless, I think we need to abolish parasitism and achieve superabundance. So by abolishing parasitism, which is by abolishing taxation, abolishing central banking, then we can prevent the satanic elites from stealing the energy of the creative people. And by achieving superabundance, we can free up the universe for creative energies to flow and for the ascension of reality. So we need to open. So with superabundance, we can open a portal of infinite possibilities, and then the ascensionary forces will be free to rise. And yeah, so superabundance is itself not necessary. Sorry, superabundance is not sufficient to achieve elevatum. Superabundance is not sufficient to promote the ascensionist goal of endless ascent. Superabundance is only a foundation. Let's see, okay, what else? Yeah, so I basically think heaven and hell are basically the same thing, because heaven is just a cage, a coffin where you're just gonna stare at clouds all day and you're just gonna be miserable. It's not. There's nothing good about heaven. Hell is like, okay, it might be worse at first, but eventually you'll get used to the flames. I mean, it's like, okay, you're gonna chill in a jacuzzi with some lava. Like it's not that deep. And yeah, so there's many ideologies that wants to sterilize the vital energies of man. They want to submit the will to power to a slave morality, and the argument is basically, oh, you'll be comfortable. Oh, you're gonna be happy by having no ambitions. You're gonna be happy by sitting on a couch all day, because at least you'll be tranquil. You know, at least you'll be comfortable, and at least you'll be well fed and quote unquote happy. Okay, but no, the purpose of life is to expand your ambition and to achieve greater magnificence. It's not to have any resting place. It's not to sit down and do nothing, or to stare at clouds all day in heaven, or to recognize some kind of utopia where everything will be okay. No, okay? Every state of existence, every condition is a stepping stone for greater vistas. Every everything, all of reality is only one step of an infinite staircase towards greater magnificence. And yeah, now once again, I emphasize that maybe Ascensionism is a failed movement. Maybe we can't succeed. Maybe Elevatum is a failed principle. Nonetheless, it is the correct moral orientation towards the world. Even if failure is inevitable, you should still strive for success. Because Ascensionism is not about external outcomes. It's about your internal belief system that such that even if magnificence is impossible to obtain in the outside world, at least you are magnificent within your spirit. Now, so let's see. Yeah, next I will cover volumes 13. Sorry, let me find it. So I'm just gonna hold on. I'm gonna get a summary of it. So all right, let me read off a bit of the summary. So I make the argument that the problem with language is that it's just a circular web of definitions. Language itself is basically useless. Language is just a tool for a higher purpose. So all meanings ultimately rest on the conclusion that existence exists, which itself provides no useful information. So syllogisms, which are supposedly the gold standard of rationality, are not rational. They are intuitive constructs built on questionable, emotion-driven premises. Logic alone can only affirm non-contradiction and produces nothing of value by itself. So logic alone can only tell you that contradictions don't exist, or that A equals A, or trivial things like this. So logic alone is completely useless. Language alone is also entirely useless. Syllogisms, like think of any syllogism is based on leaps of faith. There's no actual syllogisms are not primarily rational. Yes, there's a rational component, but syllogisms, because they're based on leaps of faith, because they're based on uncertain knowledge, they're ultimately based on value judgment and therefore intuition. So if you combine empiricism with rationalism, it's still circular and meaningless because it can't separate rational from empirical. Like is something rational or empirical, right? It's impossible to know. And there's no non-circular way to validate data. And like this is basically what empiricism is. And the only conclusion you can derive from empiricism is that existence is empirical because existence exists. Like empiricism is true because empiricism is empiricism. Like it's really epistemology. It's a tool. Epistemology cannot derive truths by itself. In fact, truths themselves are all circular anyways. What's actually truth is not truth in itself, but truth in movement, and truth in movement towards a higher goal. So all knowledge is intuitive and emotionally driven. Yes. There are different kinds of intuition. There's ascensionary intuition, which are vital, creative, and heroic, and they drive us towards mobility, magnificence, and superior existence. They are the only source of voracious, great action, and superior ideas. Stagnatory intuition produces mediocrity, indolence, and conformity. Descensionary intuitions produce parasitism, senility, right? Basically death and degeneration. Ascensionist minds create greatness, like dragons, skyscrapers, and spaceships. Lower minds produce decay, worms, and cobwebs, right? When ideas clash, higher thoughts must rise. So this is just an aesthetic understanding of Ascensionism. So a greater mind is associated with dragons, with lions, tigers, with skyscrapers, spaceships, whereas lower minds are associated with insects, worms, cobwebs. So yeah, there's an intuitive hierarchy, and truth should be subjugated to hierarchy, not vice versa. So mathematics in itself is a form of pure rationalism. And I note that numbers don't exist in reality. So 1 does not exist in reality, 2 does not exist in reality. So for 1 to actually equal 1, for a number to actually equal itself, then, and for it to mean something other than a self-reference. So 1 equals 1 is a self-reference, but if 1 equals 1, it wasn't a self-reference, it would actually mean that two things would have to occupy the same place and time, leading to absurdities like infinite identical universes stacked in one place, contradictions like 1 equals 2. So, okay, think about 1 equals 2. Right? So if 1 equals 1, that means if 1 equals 1, and let's assume this isn't a self-reference. If it is a self-reference, then it's useless in itself. But if 1 equals 1 is not merely a self-reference, that means 1 equals 2. Because 1 equals 1 means, for example, there's one rock and there's another rock that are identical. But this is not possible, because if there are 2 different rocks, then they're in 2 different places. So even if their height and their weights are the same, right? Even if the measurements are the same, they're still in 2 different places. Therefore, they're not identical. So really, 1 equals 1, if you taken seriously, it's just an absurdity. Now, if 1 equals 1 is taken as something that's meaningful, it's an absurdity. Now, so another conception of 1 equals 1 is that, okay, there's actually infinite identical universes stacked in one place. So if you apply 1 equals 1 to the universe, it means that the universe is in itself. The universe is equal to itself, but there's also a universe stacked on top of the universe that's equal to itself, and because 1 equals 1 also applies to that universe, then there's an infinite regress where there's infinite universes in the same place, but they're all identical to each other, and it doesn't really make sense, because if they're all identical to each other, they actually wouldn't be different things. They would just be an extension of the same thing. I mean, I don't know, that seems intuitive, but anyways. Mathematics alone is abstract, unreal, and useless on its own. It becomes valuable only when subordinated to elevate them as a tool. So there are a bunch of dialogues, which I think that you should read these dialogues on yourself in chapter 13. So basically, I criticize an egalitarian secular humanist. Basically, he's saying, okay, we should promote social justice, we should promote political equality, we should promote humanitarianism. The problem is that all of this is just spiritual stagnation and will lead to bureaucracy and will lead to the spiritual castration of mankind and turning mankind into robots devoid of value. Not to mention that any of these sort of bureaucracies, any form of government will be captured by satanic elites. Piers Morgan. So Piers Morgan, I sort of criticize Piers Morgan for basically just being a puppet of the establishment. And basically, people in media just defend mediocrity, and they also defend the Epstein class. And he is transformed into a block of cheese because he is consumed only by lower minds, i.e., rats. And now, at the last dialogue, I mentioned that often within the Ascensionist movement, I will use shock therapy to recalibrate people's mentalities towards the Ascensionist paradigm. So a lot of my aggressive rhetoric is for the purpose of shock therapy, to reorient the consciousness towards magnificence, valor, and higher existence. So, core conclusion. Traditional rationalism, empiricism, language, and mathematics are bankrupt, circular, or fictional. All genuine knowledge and progress stem from intuitive, emotion-driven ascensionism. Humanity must reject stagnatum, descendum, which are all conformity, mediocrity, egalitarianism, bureaucracy, and pursue elevatum, vital, creative, magnificent, upward striving at every level of thought, society, and being. So, I recommend people reading the text themselves because my explanation will be very confusing. Now, let me see. Okay, so I suppose I'll cover chapter 14 and then I'll cover the Hemlockian thoughts segment. Hold on. All right, so I'll just read off the summary because this chapter is building on previous chapters. So what can rationalism achieve on its own? There's two forms of rationalism: linguistic and or mathematical. So linguistic rationalism is based on syllogisms and propositions. Mathematical rationalism is based on the axiom of 1 equals 1, right? So both rest entirely on the law of identity, right? And these foundational axioms are not discovered by rationalism itself, they are simply presupposed. Rationalism's only possible output is a meaningless self-reference and can produce nothing else of value. All genuine knowledge comes from intuition, pattern recognition, and subconscious evaluation, not logic. So, really, intuition is just a derivative of pattern recognition and subconscious evaluation, which is what our brain does naturally. So, what our brain does naturally creates intuition. And intuition uses rationalism and empiricism as tools. To worship rationalism is to put it in the wrong category. Rationalism must be placed beneath intuition. The equal sign in mathematics leads to absurdity. 1 equals 1 implies two identical things occupying the same space and time, which is a physical and logical contradiction. So 1 equals 1, if it means anything other than a self-reference, it's actually absurd. Like, if 1 equals 1 means that there's two different ones occupying the same space and time, that's actually impossible. For two identical things to occupy the same space and time, that doesn't make sense. That's not conceivable. That in itself is irrational. So rationalism, whether it's linguistic or mathematical, is entirely useless and incoherent on its own. It depends on intuition rather than the reverse. So yes, rationalism is dependent on intuition, not vice versa. Elevatum as the principle of superior thinking and behavior. So, so the definition of being intelligent is to conserve energy. Elevatum is presented as the single word that condenses all correct superior thinking and behavior into one guiding principle. So elevatum is the distilled principle. It's like a motto for correct behavior. It doesn't replace what the correct way of thinking is. It simply is like a pointer towards it. So the problem with categories is that we are trapped in a dialectic. So every category conceptually depends on its opposite to have meaning. Every category is inseparable from and identical to its opposite. Therefore, A equals not A. The law of contradiction is true. The law of non-contradiction is false. This directly contradicts classical logic and is called heresy by pedantic eunuchs. But the author claims it exposes the worship of falsehood. So yes, people who worship categories are worshiping falsehood because categories are not real. Reality does not exist. Reality exists in a contradiction. The dialectic, false opposites, is the mechanism that traps people. Left versus right, man versus woman, rich versus poor, good versus evil, truth versus fiction, etc. In reality, everything is the same as what is not. So opposites are actually united. Opposites are actually equivalent to each other. Existence does not exist. There are no real categorical differences. So this is how the shadow elites exploit people, is that they deliberately maintain this false dialectic. So they play both sides of every culture war, every political conflict, and ideological divide. All mainstream oppositions are controlled traps designed to waste people's energy on conflicts that don't actually matter. Real power accrues to the psychopaths who break rules. Bureaucracies, i.e. nominal power, are easily manipulated. So because bureaucracies breed conformity and following rules for no reason, they're easily enslaved by the satanic shadow elite like Jeffrey Epstein. So psychopathy plus power equals more power. Common people fight illusory battles while the true rulers remain hidden. So people waste their time on useless culture wars and pointless dialectics and false oppositions. People will waste their time on these useless pursuits when the people who are actually in charge remain hidden and keep doing evil things in the background. The only escape from this false reality is to transcend all categories, to reject normative narratives. Well, not to reject normative narratives, but to create better ones, and to rise upwards. The universe itself points in one direction, up. Alternative is to remain trapped in falsehood and half-truths, drown in the sea of categories, and sink into stagnatum. So you need to rise above the crabs in the bucket, fly like a dragon, pursue ascension above all possibilities and odds. So all that matters is so the categories don't matter. Reality does not matter. The truth does not matter. All that matters is ascending beyond these pedantic categories and achieving magnificence and creating something greater. Because everything is just a foundation for the next rung on the ladder. Every step of the way, we only climb a mountain to climb an even higher mountain. We never stop. We should promote perpetual ascension towards the universal hierarchy. Upwards, of course. Upwards, the universal hierarchy. That is the correct direction. Okay, so that covers the Ascensionist Teachings. And I will be back in the next video to cover the Hemlockian Thoughts series. Thank you for watching. Elevatum.